comparison perspective, and I couldn't think of a better place for doing this than a panel together with Adrien Héritier and Bernhard Stoltenberg, who both represent very different ways of approaching the implementation of EU policies, with Adrien representing more the qualitative way of studying implementation, and Bernhard, as far as I figured out from his research proposal he put on the internet at least, and from his previous work, has a more what I would call a quantitative approach. And I myself find myself in between the two, and this is why I subtitled my talk Stuck Between a Rock and a Hard Place. This is not meant as an offense against Adrien and Bernhard, and you can figure out who's the rock and who's the hard place. It just alludes to the fact, to the difficulties one might face in choosing between the two different approaches to studying the implementation of new policies, particularly if you try to combine the two, what I seek to do in my own research. So as I said, there are essentially two approaches to studying the implementation of new policy. One is the quantitative approach, essentially doing large end studies. So you have a large quantity of data and you use statistical methods to analyze the data. Then of course you have the qualitative approach, and there you either do comparative or single case studies. Very different ways of approaching, of studying the implementation of EU policies. So what I want to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes is first discuss what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of the two approaches, the quantitative approach. Second, which is sort of the appropriate way or appropriate approach to choose if one wants to study the implementation of the EU policies. And finally, talk a bit about how one may combine the two approaches in studying the implementation of EU policies. And in doing this, I will draw on two research projects. One, which I already completed, and which is a study of the implementation of 6 different EU environmental policies in 2 countries, Spain and Germany. This policy study, this comparative policy study I did within my PhD project, which actually was a project on Europeanization and domestic change. And I did this project with Adrien Héritier, and she very convincingly persuaded me into doing this policy study, which I had originally had no intention to do. So I come from a very similar angle than Adrien does. So that's the one implementation project I want to talk about. So by discussing these 3 issues, I won't give you any definite answers. So I won't tell you which approach you should choose. Rather, what I'm trying to do is by raising various issues, particularly by discussing the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, you should be able to make up your own mind and then decide what would be the appropriate approach for the kind of research you're doing. Okay, now let's start with the quantitative approach. What are the strengths and weaknesses? Well, obviously, first strength is that it allows for a deductive, theory-guided approach to studying the implementation. You have a research question, usually is the policy effectively implemented, and then you get your theories. You can even choose a whole variety of theories, derive competing hypotheses, which you again can systematically test by using large quantity of data. Second strength then is that it's methodologically rigorous, because as I said, you can systematically control for competing explanations. And finally, because of this, it allows you actually to generate generalizable results, i.e. results that you can generalize for maybe for other areas. For instance, if you do a quantitative study of the implementation of EU environmental policies by using this kind of statistical methods, this should allow you to also make generalizations or to draw conclusions for the implementation, for the factors that account for effective implementation in other policies. Now, the weaknesses, of course, is, well, some people argue that this way, this deductive theory-guided way of doing research is stylized, simplistic, and even primitive. Because what it sometimes results into is you have this kind of very stylized hypothesis testing, where people are less interested in actually in the empirics, but more in confirming a particular theoretical approach. They instrumentalize the empirics just to confirm or to reject a certain theory they like or they don't like. Second criticism then is that because of this methodological rigor, it is positivistic, it may be dogmatic in the sense of being intolerant to other ways of doing research, ignorant, or even up to the point it becomes manipulative, in the sense that you manipulate the data in order, as I said, to reject or to confirm a particular theory you like. And American political science, to some extent, is famous for that. Or, no offense to the Americans, but the tendency you can observe is more in the States than in Europe, obviously. Okay. And what it results into is kind of this over-theorizing, over-simplifying, under-complex results you come up with that explain essentially, that claim to explain the world, but in fact when it comes down to the complexity of reality are not that much helpful. Anyway, that's a criticism. I mean, again, the criticisms are overstated to some extent, and even I'm trying to provoke here. But the whole purpose is kind of to point to the limits, because there's some truth in the criticism, and I'll come back to that later. Now, turning to the qualitative approach, here again we have strengths and weaknesses. It is an inductive, problem-driven approach that usually starts with an empirical problem at hand. You're interested in finding out not so much in confirming or rejecting a particular theory, but you want to find out why some policies work and why others don't. So you come more from the empirics rather than the theory. And then you use theories to understand the problem at hand rather than the other way around. It allows for process tracing, because when you have a quantitative approach, all you do is you measure correlations, right? But the causal relationship between the two factors that may strongly correlate, you can't say anything about. Then you have, and this is what qualitative research allows you to do. You can systematically trace the causal processes by which factor A impacts factor B, right? And finally, it allows for comprehensive explanations. As we just saw, Ariane has a very nice model explaining differential impact of Europe. Okay, now, the weakness, of course, some people, particularly the quantites, the number crunchers, argues that qualitative research is eclectic. They choose the theories, you know, as they need it, and if one theory explains it, doesn't matter whether you're not interested in, as I said, in testing theories. You just choose the theory that suits your empirical problem. Some even argue qualitative people are muddle-headed because, again, they're not really clear about the theories they use, about the theoretical assumptions behind their research. And these very detailed case studies, and I'm talking here from my own experience, sometimes considered to be rather boring. Nobody cares about implementation of the Drinking Water Directive in Catalonia, for instance, even though this might actually yield some very interesting insights. Okay, second point, and that's a major problem I will come back to later, is the problem of having too many variables, too few cases. Because when you want to explain effective implementation, the literature offers you a whole variety of potential explanatory factors, which you cannot possibly control in a qualitative study, even if you do comparison. A comparison only allows you to control for a certain amount of variables, right? So that's a major problem of qualitative research. And finally, people accuse qualitative researchers of engaging in hair splitting because they really insist sometimes on very detailed findings, and then also in making claims, not really, these very detailed case studies not allowing to make generalizable claims about anything. So very often you find policy people or even country specialists who say, yes, this is the way it works in Spain, but when we go to Germany, things are completely different. You cannot really generalize from my findings on the implementation of EU environmental policies in Spain on what's going on in Germany. So this kind of unique is okay. Now, okay, before we now discuss sort of which approach to choose, we should first define the object of our study, i.e. implementation. So what is actually implementation? And usually in the literature, you find a Babylonian variety of definitions. And that's one of the problems. Because if you want to engage in a serious conversation about what explains implementation, you have to make sure that people understand the same thing. You can identify 3 different dimensions of implementation. The first dimension is the output dimension, meaning the formal and practical implementation. Since you have a policy produced at the European level, usually codified in a directive or a regulation, and this then has to be implemented at the national or regional level, and output then refers to the legal acts and administrative directives and guidelines that implement this particular EU policy, right? That's what we call output. Now, the next dimension is outcome. And here we look at how the output, these legal acts, laws, statutes, administrative guidelines, impact upon actors' behavior. Usually the behavior of those actors to whom a policy is addressed. Take EU environmental policy, air pollution control. Here, EU policy requires the reduction of certain air emissions. And the ultimate addressee of the policy is not the member state, but it's industry that has to reduce its emission in the production of certain goods. So if you focus on outcome, you would look at how the addressees of the regulation actually comply with the requirements of the policy. It's a very different thing than looking at merely the output dimension, right? And finally, the third dimension is impact, i.e. you look at the effects which a policy has on the environment, and I mean on environment in a broader sense, the socio-economic environment, i.e. if a policy aims at reducing, at combating air pollution, you would look at to what extent has the policy succeeded in reducing air pollution. Now it's a very difficult thing to do because you also have to control for alternative factors that even if you observe a reduction in air pollution, it might have been caused by a very different factor than the policy you're interested in. And I want to be very clear about, in my own work, and most people actually, when they do implementation studies, focus on the output dimension. Few look at outcome, and then there are also particular policy evaluation studies that look at the impact. But a lot, particularly in the area of EU policy implementation, very much focuses on the output and doesn't sort of. And in my own work, I look at very much at output and outcome only to the extent when a policy is actually also addressed at state actors' behavior. For instance, certain procedural regulation, like the Access to Information Directive, requires state authorities to grant citizen access to particular information. And if an administration refuses to grant access, that would be under the outcome rather than the output dimension. So there's a big debate in the literature to what extent, for instance, output is a necessary but not sufficient condition for outcome and impact. Because if you don't have a policy at the member state level, it can't have an impact either on actors' behavior or on the environment. But again, it's not quite clear what the causal relation between the 3 dimensions is, and you'll have to think a bit about it when you engage in your research. Okay, now we have defined what we mean by implementation. As I said, I pretty much confine the concept to output. Now, how do we measure it? How do we measure output? How do we know implementation when we see it, so to speak? First, I would say, with regard to output, it's about the complete and correct incorporation of European policy into national law, what we usually call legal implementation. And since in EU environmental policy we mostly deal with directive, it's about the correct and complete transposition of EU directives into national or sometimes regional law. This is called formal implementation or legal implementation. Second is putting the policy into practice, right? So means on the one hand, the administrative infrastructure has to be in place that allows the policy to be applied. We're talking about sufficient personnel, staff power. We're talking about technologies, monitoring technologies. We're talking about also the sort of the systematic enforcement of a policy in terms of do state actors provide both positive and negative incentives to the addressees of regulation to comply with the policy, and this is where we get into the outcome dimension of implementation, because the question whether state actors actually do provide positive or negative incentives refers more to the behavior rather than the mere policy output. And this is what we usually call practical application. So these are the two dimensions I look at when I try to study the effective or ineffective implementation of EU policies. Okay, now how do we assess implementation? We're interested in explaining why some policies are more effectively implemented than others. Okay, of course, the qualitative approach does implementation studies. You either do case studies, very detailed case studies. You take one policy and then you try to find out how this policy is implemented at the national or regional level. And that involves a lot of empirical work. Because you first have to identify what are the requirements of the EU policy, to what extent are those requirements met by the implementing legislation, and then do actually, how is this policy actually then applied? And if you do comparative case studies, that's even better, but then you have to double your effort, right? Because either you have two policies in one country, or you have one policy in two countries, or if you're really good, you have two policies in two countries. You can imagine what kind of amount of work it requires to thoroughly trace the implementation of a policy across various levels, because you start with the national level and then you have to work yourself down up to the local level. And if you study the implementation of the Drinking Water Directive, you have to go actually to the municipalities and look at how they monitor and enforce EU drinking water standards, right? So you start in Spain. I started in Madrid, then I went to Barcelona, and at the end I found myself in a little municipality in the middle of nowhere, looking whether these people actually apply EU policy standards. Now the problem, of course, then is twofold. First, you don't have really objective criteria of what is effective or not effective. At the end of the day, you make your own judgment. You come up with criteria, as I just said, requirements of the policy, and here we already have sometimes disagreement. Of course, you can consult the legal literature, you talk to policy experts, you talk to policy makers who were involved in the making of the policy, how they interpret the meaning of the policy, and there it already starts, when people have very different views of what the policy actually requires. Now, once you have pinned down the requirements of the EU policy, you have to see to what extent these requirements are met at the national level. Now, you consult legal text, of course, which is a big problem, because you may understand the logics of legislation of your own country, but particularly when you study another country, it's not sufficient that you study the legal text. You also have to understand the broader legal context in which this text is embedded. So I spent ages on understanding the logic of Spanish environmental policy, and still I'm sure that a lot of people would come to completely different assessment in terms of the effectiveness of certain regulations. So that's what I mean by there are no objective criteria. The only thing you can do, you can be as explicit as possible about the criteria you use to assess whether implementation is effective or not, and you can make sure that you consult as many different sources as possible when you make your judgment. But at the end of the day, it's your own judgment. And that makes it then problematic to come up with generalizable explanations, because if somebody doesn't share your assessment, the explanation is, there's no need to discuss about the explanation. And the second major problem, as I already said, is the problem of too many variables and too few cases. There are various explanations for implementation failure. And even if you do two countries and two policies, you cannot possibly be controlled for any explanation that exists in the literature. You have to make a choice here. I'll show you in a minute how I cope with the problem, what we call a small n problem, where you have only few observations on your dependent variable, but many potential explanatory factors that may account for the variation you observe. And then it's very difficult to tell which of the causal factors actually cause the variation you see on your dependent variable, in our case, effective or ineffective implementation. Now, I just give you a very overview of the 6 policies I studied, the implementation of 6 EU environmental policies in Spain and Germany, And I just made a very rough distinction between low effectiveness, medium effectiveness, high effectiveness. And so low effectiveness, drinking water in Spain. I mean, if you talk to some people in Spain, they would actually argue that the drinking water directive is quite effectively implemented. Now, and here the problem starts, right? Or the industrial plant directive. If you talk to policymakers in Spain, they don't think they haven't implemented the industrial plant directive. So again, it's sometimes very problematic to make a claim about effective implementation. Medium effectiveness, I don't want to go into details, but if you talk to the German authorities and you tell them and you think that the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive is not effectively implemented in Germany, you would hardly find somebody who would agree with that statement. Among the policymakers and the administrators, of course. If you turn to the legal literature and to some policy experts, it's a very different thing. But still there, people have different views to what extent the policy is effectively implemented or not. And high effectiveness is industrial plant and large combustion plant in Germany. Okay, this is my assessment, right? And all I'm saying is this assessment is not necessarily shared by everybody whom I met during my implementation study or who's read the results of this implementation study. Okay, now how do I cope with the small n problem? Okay, first of all, I need an explanatory model, at least, which identifies potential causal factors that may explain why some policies are better implemented than others. And the variation I want to explain is what I just showed. Low effectiveness, medium effectiveness, high effectiveness. So how do I explain implementation failure or effective implementation success? Well, Adrian already talked about the misfit. If a EU policy perfectly fits into the national regulatory structure, there is no need to expect any implementation failure whatsoever. If there's a perfect fit, the policy should be effectively implemented. I can think of any reason why a policy that by and large is compatible with the national regulatory structure in terms of the policy standards, the regulatory approach, problem-solving approach, policy instruments should give rise to implementation problems. Now we can discuss about to what extent we need a more dynamic approach to the misfit. I fully agree with Adrienne, and also to what extent you need specific requirements of a policy to cause a misfit. I saw even framework directives causing huge implementation problems, like the Industrial Plant Directive in Spain, which actually gave rise to implementation problems, although the framework is rather broad. But still, I think there is certainly a need to refine the concept of misfit. And like Adrienne, I would argue misfit is only a necessary condition. That is, without misfit, we shouldn't expect implementation problems. But you need more than misfit in order to have actually implementation failure or low effectiveness. And so this is what I call the pull and push factor as a sufficient condition. The absence of pull and push. If there is a misfitting policy and there's no pull and push, we have a high chance of seeing implementation failure. Now, what does pull and push mean? Pressure from above, there's the push factor, essentially means the Commission puts additional pressure on the member state to implement a misfitting policy, essentially by introducing infringement proceedings. That is sort of, so if we have a misfitting policy, member states resist to implement the policy, but if they face pressure from above by the Commission opening infringement proceedings, that should help to improve the effectiveness of implementation. And pressure from below, thereby I mean if domestic actors mobilize at the national regional level and try to pull the policy down, that can take very different forms. They may litigate, they may go to court. You know, EU law has direct effect, so you can actually go to court and litigate. You can actually sue the member state for not effectively implementing a policy. Or you may have a protest movement, you may have lobbying effects, whatever. So all I'm saying is, even if you have a misfitting policy, if you get pressure from above and from below, the chances of this misfitting policy being effectively implemented increase significantly. So, and then you become the major hypothesis: implementation is the less effective, the higher the misfit, and the lower the pressure for adaptation from above and from below. Now that's the central hypothesis of my research, which I sought to reject if I do it properly. But of course, you won't be surprised that my 6 policy studies essentially confirmed the hypothesis. Okay, Pull and push, yeah. So just to show you what I did coping with a small n problem. What I did, I chose 12 policies. No, 6 policies in 2 countries makes 12 observations on your dependent variable, right? So, and what I did is from the 12 observations, 2 are fit cases. So there is no misfit. And that's essentially air pollution control in Germany. So I had 2 cases where I could control for my necessary condition misfit. No misfit, no implementation problem. And if you remember the table I showed you, effectiveness was high only for 2 policies, air pollution control in Germany, and those are actually the 2 fit cases. The other 10 cases were all cases with significant misfit for both countries, Germany and Spain. So I kept essentially, for 10 cases, I kept one causal factor, my necessary condition, constant across all cases. Misfit was constant for all other 10 cases. What varied, however, was the pressure for adaptation from below and from above. So here, pressure from above is essentially the push, Commission active, introducing infringement proceedings, or no push, Commission inactive. And pressure from below is domestic mobilization pull, or no pull, in sense, no domestic mobilization. And again, the 10 policies, the 10 misfitting policies vary significantly with regard to the pressure for adaptation. And so we have domestic mobilization, Commission active, pull and push. We should have medium effectiveness at least. Not high effectiveness because we have a misfit, but at least medium effectiveness because the misfit is sort of counteracted by pressure from below and from above. And that applies to 2 policies in 2 countries. Now, no push, no pull should be no effectiveness. And this is what we find for drinking water and industrial plant in Spain. And then a mixture sort of pull and no push, or no pull and push, is the kind of medium effectiveness. And here I'm still thinking of whether it makes a difference that we have push but no pull, or we have no push but pull in terms of the effectiveness, how it plays out. I don't want to go into details, but you can actually see some interesting variation, which is completely inductive, I want to point out. I mean, this scheme here, particularly when it comes to more detailed analysis, you can only do with very detailed process tracing qualitative research. Okay. Second point. Of course, this is the qualitative approach. And what I wanted to say is, within the push and pull model, I didn't control for any alternative explanations, such as veto players, such as the sequencing of policies. I didn't. I discussed it in the introduction and the conclusion, but in my actual case studies, I could not control for more variables because I had only so few cases to look at, and I needed the variation among the cases to systematically test for my own explanations, and I couldn't take on even more explanatory factors. So there's a whole range of explanatory factors I did not systematically consider in my research. And that's a problem, of course. Because a lot of people will say, well, yes, that's very interesting, but you didn't look at veto players, you didn't look at power relations, you didn't look at this and that, so to what extent are your findings actually generalizable? And this is where the strength of the quantitative approach lies, in my view. And here we are lucky enough that the EU is the only structure of governance beyond the nation state that provides systematic data on implementation failure. Because we have the statistics published by the EU, first on transposition rates, that is essentially how many of the existing directives are actually implemented in a given member state, so we can say something about the speed of formal implementation. That's the one statistics we have. And the other statistics are the infringement proceedings. The Commission has the right to open infringement proceedings against any member state it suspects in violation of EU law. That is, that it suspects of not effectively implementing EU policies. Now, the problem with the data, of course, is it has some serious flaws. First of all, you have the problem of undetected non-compliance or undetected implementation failure, because infringement proceedings only cover a tiny, tiny portion of the actual cases of implementation failure in the member states, which has a lot to do with the limited monitoring capacity of the EU and the member states. I think that's quite obvious. Second problem is the Commission has a lot of discretion in opening infringement proceedings and in proceeding within the different stages. So, and if we accept that the Commission is a political actor, it may well be that the Commission decides to go after some member states in some cases and not go after other member states in other cases. And the two things can introduce a serious bias towards certain member states. So it may well be that Italy figures so badly in infringement proceedings, could well be that the Commission is after Italy, but not so much after Denmark, which has a very, very low number of infringement proceedings. And we can think of all kinds of reasons which may bias the Commission. We controlled for these factors. We couldn't find so far a systematic bias in the data. We currently preparing an expert survey where we go into some member states and ask policymakers, policy experts, all kinds of NGOs, industry, to assess the implementation effectiveness of given policies. And then if we find that the assessment of them is very different from the infringement proceedings this member state faces, we have a serious problem. So far we don't have any evidence for a serious bias in the data, but the proof of the pudding is still to be seen. Okay, and finally, the problem of incomplete and inconsistent data. This is not a voluntary bias. It doesn't introduce a voluntary bias in our data, but there is significant administrative sloppery going on in the Commission. Everybody who's ever been to Brussels and know how the Commission works wouldn't be surprised. But the good news is it doesn't introduce a systematic bias. If sloppery is random, so to speak, it doesn't matter for the statistics we're doing. If you don't have a theory, you can have a very strong and significant correlation between two factors. If you don't have a theory about it, you can just as well forget about the correlation. And that's a major problem. I'll come back to that in a second. So, what I want to show you here is, this is the total number of infringement proceedings opened for the EC12 between 1978 and 1999. These data are usually used both by European policymakers, particularly the Commission, and NGOs, and you name it, even political scientists, to argue that the EU is facing a growing implementation problem. That this implementation problem has increased over the years. Okay, so what I did, I sort of accounted for this, and what you get is this. Okay? So, you still have increases, but this is the second problem we have, and this has something to do with, I think you just said, that the enforcement efforts of the Commission at some certain point of time increased significantly. For instance, when the first annual report on the monitoring of EU law was published, you can see a significant increase. Second increase is the southern enlargement. After a certain period of grace expired, the Commission just went after the two new member states and introduced a whole series of infringement proceedings. Then the implementation of the single market, where the Commission finally realized that it's not enough to pass a whole lot of legal acts to make the single market work. You have to actually look and make sure that these acts are also implemented. And then in 1996, this is not northern enlargement, it's about an internal reform of the proceedings. So again, this is what I call statistical artifacts. And if you control for the increasing number of legal acts of member states on the one hand, and these kind of intensified enforcement efforts of the Commission, the curve is actually rather flat. So you can't really argue that. I'm not saying that EU doesn't have an implementation problem. All I'm saying is we don't have the data to show that the EU has an implementation problem, and neither do we have any evidence that it has increased. Here we have significant variation. I'm looking at recent opinions. It's standardized for the length of membership, because it makes a difference whether you're a member of the Commission since 1978 or whether you only recently joined. So this is already standardized, and you can see we have significant variation. This is what I want to explain in my current research project. And in order to do this, I use both quantitative and qualitative approaches, because the strength of the quantitative approach actually is it allows you to overcome small n problem. In one way, what I use the statistics for is to eliminate potential explanatory factors. I will only test factors in my comparative case studies that are significant, statistically significant. Anything that is not statistically significant, I forget for the moment, right? So I only systematically vary those variables or explanatory factors that are left after I did my quantitative analysis. So, and of course, it sometimes produces counterintuitive findings. I just show you some in order to make my point. Counterintuitive findings, one. Prominent theory disconfirmed. This is the power hypothesis, and no matter how you operationalize power, we used all kinds of possible power indicators you can come up with, or the literature came up with. You don't even have to know much of statistics to see that the power hypothesis is not even statistically significant. so the power hypothesis just goes out of the window. So I don't even have to control for that anymore in my comparative case study. Counterintuitive findings number 2, opposite outcome, i.e. the empirics show exactly the opposite from what the theory may lead you to expect. And that's the famous legitimacy hypothesis, arguing that the higher the support for the EU, the better is the implementation of EU policies. Well, it's exactly the opposite route, at least from the data. Now you can argue that the way we operationalize support for the EU is problematic. We use the usual, Euro barometer data. But this is what the other guys use as well. Okay, and I mean, we can then discuss whether this is valid or not, but within the logic, I find exactly the opposite of what the theory may lead us to expect, which I find interesting, right? So, counterintuitive findings number 3 is the last point, no theory. What we did here is, just out of fun, is we correlated the percentage of Catholic versus Protestant with the number of infringement proceedings. And this is the most significant and best finding we get in our bivariate regressions. Now, you tell me, what is the causal mechanism between whether a country that is predominantly Catholic complies less or implements less effectively EU policies than a Protestant country? I don't know yet. It may be a different legal culture. We're trying to tap into that. But this is what I really like about statistics, because sometimes you come up with completely counterintuitive findings that may lead you to look at explanations you haven't really thought about before. So I'm almost done. The quantitative approach here, as I already said, it allows you to trace causal mechanisms, which I think is extremely important because, as I said, correlations are only as good as the theory behind it. And if you want to find out what religion has to do with implementation, you have to do qualitative research because there's no theory in the literature. It allows you to control from neglected explanations to some extent, because when you go into the field and you're not completely blinded by the theories you have, you may actually come up with completely different factors you haven't even thought about when you design your research. Happens very often. I don't think you had this dynamic conception of your misfit when you actually started the research, but it came through studying the French case. And you learn from real life experience, which is really fun. And again, sometimes it gets very surprising with time. Summing up, there is no best practice. There is no best way of doing implementation studies. There is not the quantitative or the qualitative way. It all depends on the research question you have. Very important. Some research questions cannot be researched or cannot be addressed by using quantitative or qualitative methods. Second, it depends on the availability of data. If you don't have data, you can't do quantitative research. It's very simple. And to generate the research, the database I'm using now with the 6,230 infringement cases, I had a research assistant who coded for 1.5 years, 20,000 cases into a database. If you do a PhD, you don't have the time to do that. So that is a serious limitation. It depends on the resources. It's the same. It's a question of time. It's a question of money you have. It's a question of if you have any help, great. But most of us don't. So it's a one-person enterprise very often. So limited resources. And it depends on the audience you want to address. If you want to become a famous international relations scholar, I wouldn't necessarily advise you to do a policy study on the implementation of drinking water directive in Catalonia. Unless, well, but again, you have to think about the audience you want to address, right? So, my final advice, the only advice I want to give you is be pragmatic and make up your own mind. I remember somebody once advised me to do, 3 countries and 3 policies. And I was very glad in the end that I decided not to do it and only to focus on 2 countries. And okay, I ended up with 5 policies, but still, you have to be confident in terms of the research question you have, the data, and the resources that you can do it. You have only a limited amount of time to do a PhD, to complete a PhD or a postdoc, and there's no use that you come up with this wonderful research design. You don't have the time and the money and the staff power to implement it. I think I'll leave it here.